This is Seems Like History, Season 1, Episode 1, Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson's Mosaic Quilt. Hi, my name is Loretta Allen, and welcome to the very first episode of Seems Like History. I'm a writer, amateur quilt historian, and independent researcher living in the Midwest. In each one of these episodes, I'm going to take a look at one quilt, the artist who made it, and examine the world as she knew it. You may not think a square of cloth and some stitches have much to say about history, but you'd be surprised. I realize some of you may not be familiar with exactly what a quilt is. So in this very first episode, I will take the time to touch on what makes a quilt, and of course, the history of quilting, but I won't cover these basics in subsequent episodes. So come along with me as I take you on a tour of old New York at the beginning of the United States, and we meet one woman who left an amazing quilt for us to wonder over for centuries. At some point in history, people figured out that multiple layers of cloth sewn or tied together kept them warmer than a single layer. Examples of quilted clothing can be found in ancient Egypt in the First Dynasty and in the Hunan province of China dating back to 193 BC. In the Middle Ages, ladies' cloaks and gowns of the European courts were also quilted. Medieval knights wore quilted clothing beneath their armor as a second line of defense. In the Age of Enlightenment, women wore quilted satin petticoats. Those quilted petticoats were also popular in the American colonies. A quilt, in its simplest form, is 3 layers of textiles stitched or tied together, although sometimes just 2 layers without a middle layer are used, like with crazy quilts. The common way to describe what makes a quilt is to think of it as a fabric sandwich. Historically speaking, the first or bottom layer was usually one whole piece of fabric. The middle layer, the batting, was usually cotton, although wool, down, and even thin woven blankets were used, and today all sorts of commercially manufactured battings are available. The top is usually the decorative part of the quilt. It's often pieced in various colorful geometric patterns which number in the thousands, but it can also be made of applique shapes like flowers and vines and animals, even people. There's also the whole cloth quilt, which is where the maker chooses not to piece a geometric design or use applique, but rather they use just one large piece of fabric. Sometimes the fabric was plain white or a solid color, but sometimes it came from the manufacturer with one large pre-printed design on the fabric, and it's then elaborately quilted. The plain white whole cloth quilts are often called whitework. After the 3 layers of the fabric sandwich are quilted together using a running stitch, the edges are bound to keep the layers from unraveling, and now you have a finished quilt. While today most quilts are made of cotton or wool, in the past they were sometimes made of silk, linen, and even flax. Not surprisingly, quilting was brought to the colonies from Europe, but it didn't take long for the colonists to put their own spin on it. The early quilts made in the American colonies were made in the style of the European quilts. That means they were mostly made of whole cloth, or they featured what's known as a medallion style, which was one large motif in the middle, surrounded by multiple frames or borders of varying fabrics. In England, these are usually referred to as frame quilts. Another example of the early quilt was the broderie purse, which is French for Persian embroidery. Broderie purse quilts are when the maker would cut out motifs of flowers and birds from a larger piece of printed fabric, usually cut from chintz, and applique them down onto a plain piece of fabric. Pretty soon, however, pieced quilt tops would become the most commonly made type of quilt in America. In 1609, when Henry Hudson, an explorer hired by the Dutch to find an easy route to Asia by sailing up over Russia, couldn't get past Norway because of the ice pack, he decided without orders to turn around and just head west across the Atlantic and try to find a northwest passage across what is now Canada. Hudson was the first European to see Hudson Bay. Well, Hudson and the hundreds of other sailors who were with him, and of course it wasn't called Hudson Bay at the time. The bay didn't receive its current name until 1611, and that voyage didn't end so well for Hudson as his entire crew mutinied. But in 1609, Henry Hudson, obliviously unaware of the bay and the future mutiny, sailed up what is now the Hudson River and ventured as far north to what is today Albany, New York. On his return to Europe, he informed his employers of everything he'd seen and encountered, but he emphasized that the area inhabited by the Lenape people, who had been in the area for at least 6,000 years, would make a wonderful place to colonize. And that is how the Dutch ended up in what is now Manhattan in New York City, establishing New Amsterdam in 1625 by way of the Dutch West India Company. This was a chartered company of Dutch merchants as well as foreign investors. They bought the acreage from the Lenape for 60 guilders, about $1,100 in today's money, but unfortunately, the Lenape had no concept of owning land and thought that the Dutch were just paying to use it for a while and would eventually go away. That, of course, didn't happen, and today, New York City has a GDP of $1.7 trillion, and if it were its own country, would be the 12th largest economy in the world. The Dutch merchants encouraged religious tolerance and free trade. And unlike the colonies of, say, Plymouth, Massachusetts, St. Mary's, Maryland, or Germantown, Pennsylvania, New Amsterdam was founded on commerce, not religion. The Dutch were so inclusive that it's reported that by 1664, there were 18 different languages spoken in New Amsterdam out of a population of just 1,500 people. However, the English took New Amsterdam over in 1674 and it became New York. The area remained heavily Dutch, and you can still see the Dutch influence to this day. Even names we think of as being American, like the Bronx, have endured a few spelling changes over the centuries and were originally Dutch. The variety of people and cultures that the colony was famous for in the 17th century is still true today. So that brings us to the quilt and the people we'll be talking about in this episode. A product of those original Dutch settlers, Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson was born on the 11th of July, 1771 in New York. Her father's family, the Van Horns, had arrived before the 1670s. Elizabeth's mother was Anna Maria Van Cortlandt, and the Van Cortlandt family have a long storied history in the Bronx, beginning in the mid-1600s as well. Her ancestor, Olaf Van Cortlandt, was in the colonies as early as 1638 and was descended from the Dukes of Courland in Russia. But in 1771, when little Elizabeth was born, the American colonies were on the verge of war with England. So looking at the world in 1771, we see that the Boston Massacre had happened just the year before, and George III was the King of England, and Napoleon Bonaparte, well, he was still in diapers. The following year, in 1772, slavery would be outlawed in England, and just a year after that, Phyllis Wheatley, a woman, would become the first African-American writer to be published in the United States. But in the American colonies, evidence of the coming revolution couldn't be ignored. As far back as 1754, Benjamin Franklin had proposed the Albany Plan of Union, which would place the British North American colonies under a more centralized government to protect against threats, like the French. He proposed that there would be delegates from each state and a ruling president. Despite the support of many of the colonial leaders, colonial governments rejected the plan because they realized it could limit their authority in their own territories. It's important to remember that this proposed plan of action was not done out of a rebellion or to make the colonies separate from England, but it was done to establish the American colonies as a unit, a way to act as a whole rather than state by state. There are way too many factors and nuances leading up to the American Revolution for this humble podcast to go into in one episode, but one point that would have affected Elizabeth VanHorne and is relevant to quilting would have been that of the textile industry. British mercantile legislation heavily discouraged industries in the colonies that were considered a threat to the products of the mother country. England plundered the natural resources of the American colonies and then shipped them back to England, used them to make finished goods, and then sold those finished goods back to the colonists. If Americans could make their own products on a large industrial scale, it would put a serious dent in the British economy, not to mention it would deteriorate the dependency of the colonies on the motherland. To further solidify their monopoly, the Brits passed a series of laws called the Navigation Acts, dictating that the colonies could only receive European goods from England. And then taxes, taxes, taxes. Taxes on every piece of paper the colonists used, taxes on imported glass and paint, lead, and tea. Homespun fabric became a political statement in the colonies. Homespun does not necessarily mean that it was made in a person's home, but rather that the fabric was locally produced rather than imported. In 1774, the First Continental Congress decided that the colonies would not import any goods, including textiles, from Great Britain anymore. But the colonists couldn't manufacture textiles on a large scale, In fact, the British wouldn't even let the technology or the machinery to create large-scale manufacturing of textiles into the colonies. It wouldn't be until after the Revolution in 1789 that Samuel Slater would immigrate to the new country of America, bringing with him, quite illegally, the knowledge of large-scale textile manufacturing. And it would change the world. Young Elizabeth VanHorne would probably have no real sense of any of those things happening, but in 1776, when she was just 5 years old, everything would change. She experienced a comfortable, wealthy upbringing and was related to many of the influential families of old New York, such as the De Poysters, the Rensselaers, the Livingstones, Jays, Barclays, and Bayards. Her grandfather, Frederick Van Cortlandt, owned Van Cortlandt Manor, and Elizabeth would have visited there as a child. The house was built in 1748 in the Georgian style by African slaves. A 2.5-story L-shaped house, it was made of fieldstone. On the property was a grain plantation and a grist mill, and by the time the Revolution broke out, ownership of the house had passed to Elizabeth's uncle James Van Cortlandt. The manor was used during the Revolutionary War by Rochambeau, Lafayette, and George Washington. In fact, George Washington stayed in the house on more than one occasion, once in 1776 and again in 1783. And according to at least one history book, he took dinner in the house in 1781. At the age of 7, Elizabeth VanHorne would have assuredly heard of the Stockbridge Indian massacre that took place on her uncle's property in what is today called the Indian Field. The Van Cortlandt Manor is now a museum. It's the oldest house in the modern-day neighborhood of Kingsbridge in the Bronx. The land and home were donated to the city by the Van Cortlandt family and is known as Van Cortlandt Park. The building is open for tours. After winning the Revolution, Americans now had to get down to the business of figuring out just how to make this new country work. Cotton and the textile industry would propel the newly formed country to the status of world power, giving even Great Britain, who had an empire so large that the sun never set on its borders, reason for concern. The textile industry of the newly formed country would also spell disaster for the African slaves of the South, but that will be a different episode. Just a year after Washington became the first president of the United States, Elizabeth VanHorne, then 19, married Thomas Streatfeild Clarkson of Flatbush on the 30th of October in 1790. Thomas, who went by Streatfeild, was the brother of the well-known Revolutionary War hero, General Matthew Clarkson. Elizabeth VanHorne and Streatfeild Clarkson were married at the home of the bride on Smith Street in New York City. On a crisp autumn day, the ceremony was performed by the Reverend Benjamin Moore, whose son would go on to write "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Streatfeild and Matthew Clarkson had a sister named Anne, who was married to Elizabeth VanHorne's brother Garrett. So Elizabeth VanHorne and her husband Streatfeild Clarkson were the neighbors of their siblings, Anne Clarkson and Garrett VanHorne, residing at number 31 and number 33 Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Streatfeild, with one of his other brothers, Levinus Clarkson, owned a prosperous import and export business called S&L Company. You can find them listed in the historic directories of New York, and the newspapers of the time reported many ships arriving with glassware, bedding, spices, and fabrics to the warehouse of S&L Company. After her marriage, Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson went about domestic life with gusto, having 11 children, 9 daughters, and 2 sons. One can imagine the dinner parties and shopping excursions and afternoon teas that she and her sister must have participated in. While being the wife of an important merchant and birthing and raising 11 children, Elizabeth also found time to hone her artistic needle skills, most likely because she could afford servants to help with the domestic duties, thereby freeing up time to pursue creative endeavors. The 1820 census of New York shows that Elizabeth and Streatfeild Clarkson had at least 3 free black persons living with them, who were most likely paid servants. Streatfeild had befriended the local Quakers and had written several essays on slavery. It was reported that Streatfeild was always welcome in the homes of the Quakers, and in 1806, Streatfeild published 3 volumes of books called A Portraiture of Quakerism, and they can be found in the Potsdam Museum. Elizabeth's husband donated money to institutions that helped the poor, and in 1837, he donated money to the founding of the Free Episcopal Church for, quote, the people of color. In the Evening Post in 1815, it is reported that the illuminations of Lower Broadway, namely the VanHorne and Clarkson homes, were, quote, distinguished for their taste, elegance, and brilliance. In 1823, the same paper reported that Streatfeild Clarkson was on the board of the Globe Insurance Company. That meant he was rubbing elbows with the likes of John James Astor. Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson and her husband Streatfeild were at the very center of the social economic machine that set the stage for the Gilded Age of New York. By the time their son Thomas got married in 1828, Elizabeth was a confident and skilled woman of middle age, capable of creating the incredible mosaic masterpiece that now resides in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. Many people believe that Elizabeth made this honeycomb quilt, also known as a mosaic quilt, in honor of her son's marriage. The Met has assigned the date of 1830 to this quilt. In the first quarter of the 19th century, the popularity of the pieced geometric quilts that I was talking about earlier really started to take off. There are numerous surviving examples of what was then called the mathematical star. Today it's known by lots of names, most notably the Lone Star or the Bethlehem Star, and the honeycomb quilt, both of which require quite a bit of piecing and design skill. So, what is a honeycomb quilt? Well, it's a quilt made with patches of fabric cut in the shape of a hexagon. Hexagons have 6 sides of equal size. The honeycomb conjecture, a theory put forth by Marcus Terentius Varro in 36 BC, theorizes that the unique shape of the hexagon allows for the largest surface area with the least perimeter, thereby maximizing the area to perimeter ratio and saving space in the process. The internet is full of mathematical equations explaining all the angles and minutia, but that is so beyond my skill set. So just suffice it to say, hexagons minimize the amount of material needed, which is why honeybees build their homes in this shape. The hexagon can be found naturally in the universe and not just from bees. Snowflakes, no matter how plain or elaborate, have 6 sides or points. The Giant's Causeway in Ireland was created from cooled lava oozing from fissures in the earth that took place over 60 million years ago. The molten rock of the causeway cooled and contracted, cracking into a series of about 40,000 columns. Most of them are in near-perfect hexagonal shapes. And the causeway is not the only place on Earth where this has happened. It appears as though a 120-degree crack in the basalt releases the most tension. And what do you know? 120 degrees is a hexagon's interior angle. The center row of scutes on a turtle shell are also hexagons, and when hydrogen molecules freeze and bond, you guessed it, they take on the shape of hexagons. So you'll find that amazing shape in the chains that produce the double helix macromolecule in DNA. And the most fascinating thing I learned while researching this episode is that the North Pole of Saturn has a hexagonal cloud pattern visible from space. In fact, that North Pole cloud on Saturn is bigger than the whole of our Earth. The South Pole of Saturn does not have a hexagonal pattern. It has a vortex instead, which sounds really ominous to say the least. And you'll find examples of it on floors and pottery of the ancient world all the way to the bagnio at the Governor's Palace in colonial Williamsburg. In Virginia, every surviving pulpit from the 18th century is in the shape of a hexagon. It appears that industrious women armed with a needle and thread appreciated the beauty of the 6-sided polygon and set out to create some amazing quilts. The earliest examples of these types of quilts date from the 1700s in England. Almost a century after Elizabeth VanHorne made her quilt in 1830, the honeycomb pattern would have a revival in the form of grandmother's flower garden. If you walk through any antique store or antique mall in the country today, you'll probably see at least one grandmother's flower garden. I personally own 3. Nowadays, the hexi quilt is having yet another revival as English paper piecing is more popular than ever, due in part to the resurgence of hand stitching and the slow stitch movement. So when Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson set about making her honeycomb quilt, she might have used a pattern with instructions, or she may have had knowledge passed on to her from a family member. Women exchange patterns all the time, we still do, and according to the Illinois State Museum, the oldest surviving hexagon template was found in England dating to 1770. The earliest date-inscribed hexagon quilt is from 1796, attributed to Anne Ruggles of England, and is in the International Quilt Museum. And right there in New York, the same time that Elizabeth was living on Broadway, Maria Hester Monroe, the daughter of President James Monroe, was busy making her own honeycomb quilt that she never finished. Experts believe that Monroe's quilt was made between 1828 and 1836. So Elizabeth would have had plenty of exposure to this quilt pattern that was quite possibly older than she was. Essentially, a honeycomb quilt is built up from small to larger units. Usually there is one central hexagon representing the center of a flower with 6 hexes surrounding it representing the flower petals. Those 7 pieces make one block or unit. And after making enough hexes for the size quilt you want, you join them all together. The variation of designs that can be made with this one little 6-sided piece of fabric is staggering. Everything from the flower I just described to diamonds. I've found numerous sources that say that the earliest publication of the honeycomb quilt pattern came from the American periodical Godey's Lady's Book in 1835. However, I also found the pattern in a publication called The American Girl's Book by Miss Leslie in 1831. It too gives almost the exact same instructions as Godey's. And bear with me, these instructions are overly wordy and very 19th century sounding, but I'm going to read them to you anyway. So here's the instructions in the book. It says, to make this quilt properly, you must first cut out a piece of pasteboard of the size you intend to make the patches and of a hexagon or 6-sided form. Then lay this model on your calico and cut your patches of the same shape, allowing a little larger all around for turning in at the edges. So that's what's known as your seam allowance. Of course, the patches must all be exactly of the same size. Get some stiff papers and cut them also into hexagons, precisely the size of the pasteboard model. Prepare as many of these papers as you have patches of fabric. Baste or tack a patch upon every paper, turning down the edge of the calico over the wrong side. Sew together neatly over the edge. The papers must be left in to keep the patches in shape till the whole is completed. So in shorter modern day terminology, you basically wrap the fabric around the paper template, whip stitch the hexes together, and don't take the papers out until it's ready to be quilted. Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson's quilt is made of hundreds of small pieces of printed cotton, and through her husband's import and export business, she would have had access to the best fabric. She even incorporated what we call fussy cutting, which means to intentionally cut a piece of fabric that features a specific detail or image, so that when you piece them side by side, those details then create a whole new image. Sort of like a kaleidoscope. At first, I thought the border on her quilt was a pre-printed design on the fabric that she just cut strips from. But when I looked at it closely, it's been fussy cut from a striped fabric and then pieced in such a way, interspersed with solid brown hexes, that it appears like one whole piece of fabric with a printed design. Throughout the quilt, not just the border, she incorporated the fussy cut technique. All of these hexes surround a large and elaborate central medallion also made from hexes. The planning for this quilt alone, the medallion, the border, the color balance, the way it all comes together, is an impressive feat, and it took my breath away the first time I saw it. This quilt was donated to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art by Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson's great-granddaughter, Emily Villette Clarkson Moore, who died in 1946. Emily was a lover of the arts, having graduated from the Chautauqua School of Photography in 1890, and she had won numerous awards for her photography. Emily also donated family furniture, silver, and paintings, among them a miniature portrait of Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson painted while in mourning for her husband, by the American artist Thomas Sear Cummings. At the time of researching this episode, Elizabeth's quilt is the oldest example of a wholly pieced American quilt in the museum's collection. It's hard to believe that this would have been the only quilt that Elizabeth would have made, but this is the only one that has been donated to a museum for public viewing, so if there are others, sadly, the public does not have access to them. However, there is an example of a whole cloth white quilted counterpane in the Smithsonian Institute made by Eve Van Cortlandt White when she lived at the Van Cortlandt House in 1760. Eve, according to the family Bible, was born in 1736 and was the aunt of Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson. Eve's white linen quilted counterpane is one of the earliest dated American quilts in existence. The pattern of flowers, feathery stems, and open baskets surround a central quatrefoil medallion. The design is accented by a background of quilted parallel lines just 1/8 inch apart, and that just makes my eyes cross thinking about it. Eve made the quilt for her wedding that took place the following year to Henry White, who was the president of the New York Chamber of Commerce and was a prominent loyalist. As a result, Eve and Henry had to evacuate New York with their children in 1783 after America won the Revolutionary War. The family moved into Golden Square in Piccadilly in London. Henry White died just a few years later in 1786, and an obituary in London said, quote, "In public life, he united the dignity of office with the respectability and integrity of a British merchant, and during the late troubles in America, exhibited a zeal and attachment to government that was at once exemplary and appropriate." However, he was found guilty of treason back in New York and was made to forfeit all of his estates in 1779. Eve remained in England until 1804 when she moved back to New York into a house at 11 Broadway, which she had recently inherited from her father. The Smithsonian postulates that Eve Van Cortlandt White moved back to America to be near two of her children who lived in New York. It's possible Eve wanted to be close to her extended family as well. Eve Van Cortlandt White would have been neighbors with her niece, Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson, for some years. Eve died at the age of 100 in 1836. Hers was a life witnessing some of the most amazing events in American history. She was born during the reign of King George II, lived through the reign of King George III, and died at the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria. I mention Eve and her white counterpane quilt to emphasize not only the needlework talents of Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson's family, but also their wealth. Many people believe that early quilts in America were made out of necessity. While there might be examples of that throughout the colonies, most quilt experts believe that that's mostly a myth. Contrary to what some might think, early quilts in America were not made out of necessity. They were made as a statement of wealth, status, and skill, of which Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson and her Aunt Eve had all three. Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson moved out of her house at 33 Broadway and moved to 11 West 21st Street in 1844, following the death of her husband, Streatfeild. Streatfeild was a successful merchant, and he owned farms, quarries, and ships that carried merchandise back and forth across the Atlantic. An example of his wealth is that in his will, he left his wife, Elizabeth, $30,000 and the property at number 33 Broadway. That's about $1 million in today's money, and that's not counting what the property was worth. He also left each of his living daughters an amount to the equivalent of about $150,000. 4 of Elizabeth and Streatfield's daughters never married and remained with their mother. The 1850 census of New York shows Elizabeth, age 79, with 6 adult females in her household, all with the last name Clarkson. The 1850 census of New York doesn't specify how the women were related to Elizabeth, and since so many people in the Clarkson family used the same names over and over, it's difficult to determine the exact relationship. However, it is likely that a few, if not all, of the women in her house in the 1850 census are her daughters. Living in the household were also 2 women from Iceland, Mary and Sarah Brennan, and a black male named James Hammond, whose occupation was listed as waiter. These 3, the 2 from Iceland and the black male, were most likely paid servants. Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson died in 1852 at the age of 81. She and her husband are interred in the Clarkson family vault in Flatbush. The honeycomb quilt that Elizabeth made was clearly a treasured family heirloom. Thankfully, her great-granddaughter Emily had the forethought to take good care of it and then the generosity to entrust it to the Met. As a genealogist, I know how difficult it can be to find women in the historical record. While women made huge contributions to the world, those contributions often are not recorded. In my own search for my ancestors, I've often found my foremothers listed as just Mrs. Somebody. Not even their birth name is inscribed on their tombstone. A lot of women's accomplishments will forever go unseen because of the limitations put on their sex. They could not vote, and even until as recently as 1974, they couldn't get a loan or open a credit card on their own. So for me, this is where we find the women. We find our foremothers in the things they made, and those things were more often than not made from cloth. Textiles are perishable, so it is of the utmost importance that these old quilts be documented and preserved. Let's give a voice to the ghosts from the past. Images of Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson's Mosaic Quilt are available on the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art's website, and the images of Eve Van Cortlandt White's counterpane quilt are available on the Smithsonian website. For information on the Van Cortlandt Manor home and the Van Cortlandt Park, you can visit their Facebook page. There are so many things in this podcast that I could have done a deeper dive on, but there's just no way I could cram it all into this one episode. And I know inevitably somebody will say that I left something out or overlooked some important detail, but I have tried my best to present the story of Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson as honestly as I could in this limited format. These episodes are researched, written, and hosted by me, Loretta Allen. If you would like to see more images of Elizabeth VanHorne Clarkson's quilt and her family, you can visit my Instagram account, Seems Like History, or my YouTube channel by the same name, where I've made a slideshow to accompany this podcast. Remember, that's Seems Like History, SEAMS. Join me next time when we go to Virginia during the American Civil War, and we meet an incredible woman named Elizabeth Ann Bouchon, and we take a look at her beautiful red, green, and gold applique quilt and dive into the Civil War battle that took place in her backyard. Thank you, and have a great day.